A second time, and I call the honourable member for Hotham.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to speak today on the Social Services Legislation Amendment because it gives me a chance to express how angry I am on behalf of my constituents in Hotham that the government is going ahead with this raft of measures that are nothing other than an unbridled attack on the young people of this country. Now, I'm angry on behalf of the young people who live in my electorate and those around Australia, Deputy Speaker, but it goes well beyond that because the legislation that is under review by the House today is a broader conversation about what kind of country we want to live in, how we are going to help support young people adapt to economic change that is underway in this country. And the measures that are in the bill just go right to the heart of these difficult questions about how we can express the egalitarianism that we all talk about so much in our conversations with one another in a true economic sense. Deputy Speaker, I'll go through the critical measures in the bill so those in the gallery and the kids who are watching are able to understand some of the proposals that are before us. There are four that I want to focus on in particular. The first is the change that is being suggested in this legislation, where people who apply for working age payments, excluding the widow's allowance, will have to wait for 1 week before any payment begins to them. So essentially, anyone who needs the support of the state in some way or another is being told that they'll survive for 1 full week without income. Second, Deputy Speaker, there is a new requirement for young people under the age of 25 who will now have to wait 4 weeks before they receive any income support from the state. So young people doing it tough without work will receive no funding at all for 1 month. The third is the extension of youth allowance, Deputy Speaker, which applies today to Australians under the age of 22, reflecting, I think, the general view that there's some level of additional support for young people from family. But under this legislation, Deputy Speaker, the age at which youth allowance applies instead of something like New Start, so unemployment benefits, is being raised from 22 to 24. It's a significantly lower payment, Deputy Speaker. So now for everyone in this country who is between 22 and 24 who's unemployed, they're now going to see a real cut to their payments. And we see, fourth, Deputy Speaker, indexation changes. So essentially what the impact of this is that incomes will be held down because the point at which income support will kick in is being suppressed, essentially, a move that will do nothing more than simply suppress the incomes of Australians who are doing it tough while the rest of the nation grows more wealthy. Deputy Speaker, I think this legislation of any of the issues that we discuss in this House makes it fully transparent some of the values that underlie the decisions that are made by this government. They are values which tell us that people who are on welfare, who have some support of the state, should be made to suffer because they have no incomes of their own. That is the effect of some of these provisions, which will directly put many more Australians into poverty. It is a legislation that surely could only have been written by someone who believes that inequality in this country doesn't matter. And again, I'd just say, Deputy Speaker, the clear, direct impact of this legislation is that many more thousands of Australians will end up living in poverty, some incredibly deep poverty. And it's a reminder for us, Deputy Speaker, of what this government wants Australia to look like, and that is a place where the generations of people who have fought for better social protections, for people who are doing it tough, are being stripped back slowly and surely. And we've seen that not just in the legislation that we're discussing today, but in many other proposals that have been put forward by this government, where it's changes to the indexation rate of the pension that will see pensioners worse off over time, whether it's a GP tax, where people, no matter how sick in this country, will have to pay to go to the doctor, clearly a move that will put people who are on lower incomes in an already worse position. Now, Deputy Speaker, I do reflect at times what could possibly be driving the motivations that cause the government to put forward legislation like this, which will so severely damage the quality of life for people in this country who need the government's help. I have to say it's one of only two things. It's either that the government's a group of not very nice people, or it's because they just don't get it. They're just not living in the Australia that I and most of my constituents live in. And I'm going to give the government the benefit of doubt, Deputy Speaker, and assume that it must be the latter, because I know many people on the other side of the House and I know them to be good people. Deputy Speaker, I have to believe that because in the world that those opposite live in, I have to infer that they've designed this legislation for a group of very different young people than the ones that I represent in my community of Hotham. I know that for some young people in Australia, provisions like denying them any income for a month may seem workable when you're talking about a young person who's got lots of family support. Maybe a young person who lives at home with their parents, a young person who can raid the fridge if they need something to eat. Deputy Speaker, a young person who can borrow mum and dad's car, maybe borrow $50 if their parents are feeling like lending them a bit of cash. For these young people, it's a very different proposition to be without income for a month than the young people who I represent. The young people that I represent, many of them don't live in a household like that. Many of them don't have families that support them. Some families just can't afford that themselves. They themselves are struggling. Many of them may also be in a situation where they need the support of government. And I just think when we reflect on some of the comments and some of the other indicators that we hear from those on the other side of the House, I do feel like the comments of the Treasurer really do lead me to believe that this is where all this has come from. We know that in the past the Treasurer has made ridiculous comments like suggesting that poor people in this country don't drive cars, obviously completely factually incorrect and offensive. We had another example relatively recently where the Treasurer said that the response that people should take to not being able to afford a house is just to go out there and get a better job, as if there are low-income people all over this country who just hadn't thought of that already. And it just is another indication of how seriously this government doesn't get it, and the fact that they are living in what feels to be a very different country than the people that I'm representing in Hotham. Deputy Speaker, as you can probably sense, I'm very upset about a lot of the proposals in this legislation. And one of the things that for me makes all this so much worse is that all of these measures are being enacted in a time of rising unemployment for young people in this country. In fact, when you look at the numbers from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, we've seen that youth joblessness has reached its highest point now since 1998. There are 15% of young people who are between the ages of 15 and 24 who are looking for work and can't find it. 1 in 5 between 15 and 19 are unemployed. And these are the macro national figures, Deputy Speaker. We know, of course, that these figures look very different when we look at different parts of the country. In rural and regional areas of Australia, Cairns is one that comes to mind, Northern Victoria, youth unemployment is north of 20%, so that's 1 in 5 people in that broad age range who are looking for work and can't find it. It is an area of extraordinary national concern, and one in which we've seen absolutely zero leadership from those on the other side of the House, instead going to these draconian measures that seem to infer that if young people are unemployed, then we can bully them into the workforce by taking away the unemployment support that they receive. Deputy Speaker, I know that you're probably aware there are lots of welfare organisations which are trying to elevate this issue on the national agenda. The Brotherhood of St Lawrence has done some fantastic work looking at areas of national concern for youth unemployment and brought forward some really serious proposals that deserve real national attention. We've even heard the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, which is not known for its speaking out generally on poverty issues, but they indeed, amongst other business organisations, have pointed out this as an area of national concern. And I would have thought if the government wasn't going to listen to us, then perhaps they'll listen to the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Deputy Speaker, one of the reasons that youth unemployment is such a concern is that we know that the impacts of being unemployed early in life can actually have repercussions for decades for the young people that are affected by this. So in a period where youth unemployment is rising, this is not a short-term issue that's going to just affect this country for 5 or 6 years. If we do allow this situation to continue, if we allow young people to start out their working life without the opportunities that they need to get off to a great start, then we're going to pay for that as a nation. There are issues of concern because of the people affected, but it's got much broader social and economic implications, this youth unemployment problem for us. There are lots of studies that have been done in very famous universities around the world which look at what effect unemployment early in life has on people. We know that young people who have this experience end up with something we call wage scars, which means that for a young person who's in exactly the same position but manages to get lucky and find a job, when we track those two people throughout their lives, we find that the person who experienced long periods of unemployment early in their life will be at a much lower wage when they're in their 40s and 50s than the other person. And there's lots of literature about why we do see that scarring effect. But, Deputy Speaker, one of the most distressing things that you find when you look into the literature of the long-term implications of youth unemployment is the mental health and physical health impacts that people experience in their 40s and 50s. And I would just say that if the government is not willing to come to the party and have a serious conversation about this youth unemployment problem for the reasons of the young people affected, then they should be thinking about what our society is going to look like in 30 or 40 years when we have a potential generation of young people who've not gotten the help and support they need and instead have been attacked by having their income taken away from them for a month. Now, Deputy Speaker, there are some reasons I've talked about concerns for youth unemployment, but there's one more that I just want to touch on before I complete my comments. I'm really worried about youth unemployment because when we look at the very highest level, the way that our economy is changing in Australia, I think we are looking into a period where the challenge of getting young people off to a great start in life is growing, not diminishing. What we are seeing is that technology and globalisation are changing our economy very quickly, very dramatically. There was a study published by Oxford University in 2013 which suggested that within 20 years, 40% of the jobs that exist today will have been replaced by machines. The OECD did a similar study looking at the impact of globalisation, finding that within a similar time period, 20% of jobs will be replaced by globalisation, effectively outsourcing, offshoring to other countries. And, Deputy Speaker, when we look at the jobs that are being outsourced and the jobs that are being replaced by, where people are being replaced by machines, they are the kind of entry-level jobs that young people for generation after generation after generation have used to get their foot in the door, to get their start in the workforce. I'm thinking, Deputy Speaker, about, for example, law firms taking on article clerks. And in the first years of the period at the law firm, article clerks would do very routine tasks. They'd look through documents, look for keywords in documents. You can imagine, Deputy Speaker, all this now is being done today by computers. I'm thinking of young people who might have, a generation ago, got a job in a call centre. Of course, we know, Deputy Speaker, now so many of those jobs are being offshored into other countries. Now, it's important that we don't just lament this economic change, because clearly Australia is getting a lot of benefit from it. We're growing more and more wealthy. We're one of the richest countries in the world. But we do need to think about how we have to change the way that we support young people in order to ensure that they're not victims of what is happening here and that they get to benefit from this increasing prosperity that we're so lucky to see in our country. When I think about, stories that we hear about people in this country who've played national leadership roles, who've had great success. Paul Keating, for example, never finished high school. Lindsay Fox was the same. These were men that went out and got their start in life, took some risks and ended up being very successful. But, Deputy Speaker, we're not going to see this happen anymore. Young people are only going to be able to get ahead if they stick with school, if they get a skill and if they get a good start into the workforce. And I really want to have a conversation in this parliament about how we can make sure that young people get that opportunity that they need. But one thing I am very confident about, Deputy Speaker, is that we are not going to see that transition happen for young people when we focus instead on punishing them for what is a changing economic environment and bad luck in many instances. Young people are usually unemployed because there are no job opportunities. No job opportunities for their level of skill and no job opportunities in the place where they live. And the idea that the key response of this government is to take away any income from those young people for a month, I think it absolutely beggars belief, Deputy Speaker, and as I say, just reflects the type of nation that these people want to live in and their really very false understanding of what life is like out there for young Australians.